Welcome to the Women's Connection. I'm Barrie-Louise Switzen, your moderator. The Women's Connection is a program about events shaping women's lives and helping one gain authentic power on a personal or professional level. So won't you stay tuned?
Welcome. Even though I'm a real estate broker, I know a lot that goes on in buying and selling a real estate property here in Manhattan. However, I don't know the other side being the attorney's side. What exactly transpires with the client at that point in time? And with me is Sabra Sasson, and I would like to welcome Sabra. Welcome.
Thank you so much.
Let's start at the beginning. How did you really get involved in real estate?
So the short version is, originally when I went to law school, I didn't know that I wanted to be a real estate attorney. I just wanted to help people. So I thought I would do trust and estates, help people preserve their wealth and their assets. And over the course of law school and a few jobs that I had afterwards, I wound up getting some experience in real estate, and I wound up realizing I loved it. I really enjoyed, especially the first-time home buyer, walking them through the entire process to get them from the excitement of having an accepted offer all the way to closing. And so that's pretty much how it started, and I worked for many years for different law firms and attorneys, really getting the ins and outs of residential as well as commercial real estate.
When is the best time for, let's say, a buyer to talk to an attorney or interview an attorney?
For me, I would absolutely love it if somebody would come to me very early in the process, like even before they find that dream property that they want to buy. And the reason why I say that is because, from my experience, most of my clients come to me after the offer has been accepted, and the real estate broker, such as yourself, says, "Who's your lawyer? We're ready to get going with the contract." And now they're, racing to go figure out who should I buy. But if they find me early on while they're starting to look for property, they can interview me, they can interview various attorneys, and really pick somebody that they feel a connection with, and someone that they know is right, someone who's experienced, someone who can adequately represent their interests, rather than the last second grabbing, somebody that they have to find.
Well, what would you say is the key question to ask an attorney when they're interviewing one?
Great. So they should ask questions about the experience of the lawyer, if they're familiar with the kind of property that you're looking to purchase. So if you're buying a co-op or a condo, there's special rules, different types of contracts that we use for those, and there's different nuances that happen at the closing table. So if you're working with someone who's not familiar with those differences, you may not be adequately represented. So you want to find somebody who's experienced with the kind of property that you'll be purchasing. You'll want to ask about their experience. Have they represented many people? Do they have the bandwidth to take on a new client right now?
When you say bandwidth, what do you mean by bandwidth?
Well, if their practice is full and they don't have the time or attention to give to you because they have too many new clients that came in, let's say, so you want someone who's going to be responsive, who's available to you when you need answers. Things move very quickly in real estate, and when you're trying to make decisions as to different provisions that go in a contract or what happens along the way when you're doing your mortgage or financing application, you're going to want to be able to access and reach your lawyer and find someone who can communicate in the same way that you do. Maybe that's email, maybe it's by text. There's a lot of different technology that we're using. Even my practice, I was a little resistant to texting my clients, but I find that some of them are more comfortable that way, and I'm in service to the clients. And so if that's the way that they communicate, I try to also communicate in a way that they're comfortable with.
Now, one of the key questions everybody wants to know is, how much do you charge for your services? I'm not asking you how much, but just what should somebody be prepared to pay a real estate broker when they're buying an apartment or a home versus selling a place?
So not to correct you, but I think you meant as a real estate attorney. So when you're looking to hire a real estate lawyer, typically the fees for real estate attorneys average between $1,800 to $2,500. I've heard of some lawyers charging as high as $3,000. And if you go to the much bigger law firms, they typically charge hourly. And there, if you're going to hire someone hourly, you're looking at closer to $5,000, which that's a lot for a real estate purchase.
What is entailed in doing this? I know there's the contract, and then there's riders and everything else. And in the state of New York, everything keeps changing. And one of the things that we always see is the Bloomberg contract. What's so special about the Bloomberg contract?
So this form contract, I refer to it as the form contract, but yes, the proper name is the Bloomberg or Blumberg forms. And they were put together by other attorneys through the Bar Association, and it's the standard form. So all of the real estate attorneys, at least the ones that I work with, we all start with that basic form, so we all kind of start on the same platform, and we may modify it here and there, but we make it obvious that we're making changes to the form. It pretty much covers most of the issues that could come up in a real estate transaction. It has the names of people buying, it has your purchase and sale price, of course there's a contract deposit that you pay, it'll state whether it's subject to financing or not. Also, the down payment gets placed into an escrow account. So one of the really important provisions are what happens with the money that's deposited in escrow. And when I'm talking about escrow, that really means it's being deposited with an attorney. So if I'm representing the seller, it goes into my escrow account. Or if I'm representing the buyer, then my client's money will be deposited into the seller's attorney's escrow account, and it's protected, and there's all these provisions in the contract that state exactly what happens and how it's protected. So that's the basic form, the Blumberg that you're talking about.
Well, now we're talking about, let's see, you've got the lead paint rider, you have the bed bug rider. What other kind of riders would you find in a contract?
So again, through practicing all these years, we find, the Blumberg form covers many different things, but as you practice, you realize different issues come up with different clients, and so you want to protect your client. And so for me, I add an additional rider, so I'll have a purchaser's rider that I'll attach to the contract, and pretty much the provisions came from my experience. One client a long time ago purchased, and one of the pipes burst in the house. And would you know that the seller thought that as soon as they signed the contract, that meant they already sold the house. And so they canceled their homeowner's insurance policy. And yes, this happened. So now we had a scramble to try to reinstate the policy so that I could cover this flood that happened in the home. So that was interesting. So now I have a provision that states that the seller has to maintain that insurance policy up until the date of closing. So that's an example.
With everything being so litigious, what other rider points do you usually put on your contracts for somebody buying the apartment or home?
Sure. So there's a lot of things that go in a contract. Like, why would you even need a contract? You want a contract because purchasing real estate is very complicated. It's not just agreeing upon the price and saying, okay, we're going to close on this date. There's a lot of other things that happen in between. You want to make sure that property is still standing when you get to closing. You may want to make sure that the appliances in the apartment or the house are working order, right? You might want to make sure that what if you can't qualify or actually get the mortgage commitment if you need financing. You may believe that you can get it, maybe a bank told you could, but when they actually looked at all the documents or they looked at the building, they may realize, you know what, we can't actually finance this. So what happens? You don't want to risk losing your down payment. So this is why it's so important to have a contract that's drafted, that's reviewed by a lawyer, and have you understand what's in there. So like some of the other things that I might put into my contract, I have a rider, you mentioned a bed bug and lead-based paint, so I have a statement in there that the seller actually represents to us by signing this contract whether or not there's been noise complaints, whether there's ever been any leaks in their apartments, if there's ever been any bed bugs, and if there was, were they treated, were they not treated, and you want some affirmative statements from the seller in your contract, just like the seller may have additional affirmative statements that they want you to make in the contract.
All right, let's flip it over. What does the seller usually put into the rider on their contracts? So
as a seller, the seller's concerned about two things. Is the buyer willing to pay my price, and do they have the funds to pay for it? That's pretty much all that the seller really cares about. So if you find a buyer who's willing to pay whatever it is that the seller is asking for, or whatever price that they can agree to, now you need to know, can this buyer actually come up with the funds? So they're either going to buy it all cash, which means they already have the funds somewhere in an account ready to pay for this place, or they're going to finance. And if they're going to finance, the buyer's going to need some time to apply for a mortgage. So one of the things the seller wants to know is, well, how much time do you need? You know, can you find a bank to get me a mortgage commitment in 30 days, or do you need 45 days? And so the seller's going to be concerned about time. So when can we close? When can I get my hands on the money? So that's a lot of the emphasis of what's talked about. Also, the seller wants to know, can the seller qualify? So they'll try to pre-qualify them, have certain statements as to whether the buyer ever filed for bankruptcy. If in a co-op, or here in Manhattan there's a lot of co-ops, they may want a representation from the buyer that they've never been denied by another co-op board. That would be something of interest to know.
Let's go back to being turned down by a board, which is pretty traumatic. I know when my client got turned down by a board, I ate chocolate for a week. I was mortified. But do you have, and boards never tell you why you were turned down. So how would you go about trying to prevent that from happening?
When I work with a client, most of my clients come through real estate brokers such as yourself, and so a lot of times I find that the real estate brokers do a great job. They do an amazing job of vetting these buyers, going through their finances, making sure that they really are qualified buyers, making sure that they can actually afford to buy the place that they're intending to purchase. So a lot of my work is done from that regard. But I do have a long conversation with my clients about where are they getting their funds from, are their funds readily available, particularly with regard to the down payment. You know, the worst thing is to sign a contract, you write a check for the down payment, and it bounces. That's so embarrassing, right? But it happens sometimes. They're not prepared, they're all excited, and they just forget to do that one transfer. They did the transfer, but it needed an extra day to clear, whatever the case may be. But in terms of, you know, the board application, I talk to them, make sure everything's typed, everything's nice and neat. The brokers usually handle a lot of that. And I really wait for the mortgage commitment, and I look at all the conditions on there. I want to make sure that my clients can comply with all of the conditions. Sometimes there are conditions in a commitment letter that they weren't expecting to see, and they may not be able to clear them. Like, let's say they have a lot of debt on a credit card, and the bank says, well, we'll fund this, but you need to pay off your $30,000 credit card debt. That could be a problem. So these are the things that I look at to prepare my clients so that they are prepared when they go before the board or getting ready for closing.
Who orders title insurance? Is it the seller's side or the buyer's side? And what exactly is title insurance? And how long is it good for?
Great questions. So in terms of title insurance, the buyer is the one who would be ordering that, because the seller, they're making a representation, they own the property, and they are the ones who are qualified and authorized to convey title. So what does that mean? So they're going to, if it's a house or a condo, the buyer is actually going to receive a bargain and sale deed, which will convey title of the property to the buyer. If it's a co-op, it's a little different. You're still getting title, but we just have it in two different forms. So one's a proprietary lease, and one's a stock certificate representing the number of shares that the buyer is going to own in the co-op building. So in terms of title insurance, when you're purchasing a house, because it's a deed, a house or a condo, the title company does a full-blown title search. They do search the records, search the names of both parties, and we get this thick title report. It's usually about 50 to 100 pages, sometimes longer, especially if one of the clients have a common name. There'll be a lot of judgment that show up in the person's name if they're like, you know, John Doe, you know, or just somebody with a common name like Brown. There'll be a lot of names in that report. And so it'll show and reveal all the different issues with regard to the property. Any mortgages, any liens, judgments that are showing up against the property. With a co-op, they're still doing a search, but those searches come back, they're usually a bit thinner, because what they're doing is they're searching their records in Albany to look to see if anyone filed a lien against the property. Because again, you're buying shares, so it's kind of like when you buy a car, and maybe you finance the car, but there's a mortgage filed with regard to your car. It's a financing statement. So that's similar, and the only way to put a lien against a car is to file a financing statement with Albany. So similar to that with a co-op, because you're buying shares, the only way to put a lien against the shares, because it's not physical property like the share, you know, or real estate that you can go and find the deed for, they file a financing statement up in Albany, and that represents the bank's interest in the shares of the co-op unit. And so that's how we find it. So you're still doing a title search, we just call it different things.
Oh, interesting. How long is a title search good for?
So a title search typically, well, the search itself is one thing, and then when you get to the closing table, when you're buying a condo or a house, you're actually purchasing title insurance. It's a one-time purchase. You purchase it at the closing table. That's the only time that you could buy it, and it lasts for the entire lifetime that, or the amount of time that you own the property. So for as long as the buyer owns the property, that's how long the insurance is good for. And you're insuring the value of the property. So if you're buying a place for $500,000 and your insurance is good for $500,000. There are some exceptions. You could buy things like a market value rider and things like that. But ultimately, most people today are buying just the insurance for the actual amount of the purchase that they're purchasing for.
Do you find that buyers are realistic in their expectations, or even sellers realistic in their expectations?
Thankfully, many of the clients I'm working with now are. There are some times I come across clients who've, just different expectations. I don't know that I would label them as realistic or unrealistic, just people have different needs. For instance, I had a client who, they were selling a co-op, and then they were buying a house. And they needed to figure out how to coordinate the sale because they didn't want to move twice. They had 3 young kids. So they found a buyer right away for their co-op, but the house that they wanted to move into was in a neighborhood they really wanted to get into, but everything was so expensive. But they found someone who bought a place for relatively cheap, and they invested a lot of money. So it was like a small-time builder, and he improved the property greatly. And so they were able to get in at a lower price point into this neighborhood that they really wanted to be in. The construction was taking a bit longer than they had planned, and thankfully, I was able to help negotiate with their buyer that they can stay in the property for 60 days beyond closing, so that there was plenty of time for us to then finish up whatever needed to get done with the house, make sure they got the certificate of occupancy, that all the permits were closed, and so that they can close on the purchase. And yeah, it was actually quite interesting, the entire ride, but that was just a need. I don't know that that's an unreasonable expectation that, they demanded we have to get it done in that time, but that's what they needed. And so again, it's all part of being in service and trying to figure out and negotiate a way to balance both sides, and get them to the closing table.
You're also, you're not a divorce attorney, but you do prenups. Have you come across any kind of weird situation where a couple is getting divorced and they either have a prenup about the apartment or don't have prenup about the apartment that you'd like to share?
So I do practice matrimonial law. I do not do any litigation. I'm a divorce mediator, attorney mediator, and a collaborative attorney. And I do prenups. I've been doing quite a few of them lately. I haven't yet had one where I've had situations where people were getting divorced and they had a prenup, and it actually made their life so much easier because everything was already resolved and done. That particular couple didn't have children, so we didn't have to deal with that. But all their financial stuff was already handled, and it was just very simple. Just go drop the paperwork and get them divorced. For other couples that I'm working with, for instance, now who are doing prenups, some people come into the relationship, they already own a home or own property, and they're both planning to live there as a married couple after their wedding date. So all these things can be addressed and handled in the prenup. And we also start talking about interesting provisions where, again, God forbid, there's a divorce down the road and they're living in this house, how long can they stay before they have to find a new home to go to? So if one of them owns the property, they both live there after they get married, and then if down the road there's a divorce, probably the one who doesn't own the property is the one who's going to need to leave. And it's a question of you're giving them 30 days, you're giving them 90 days to stay. It could be an uncomfortable situation. So it's interesting how they talk about that now and figure it out ahead of time.
Do you find that most people talk about it in advance, or do they wait till the 12th hour when the gun is to their head?
So again, a lot of the people that come to me, they come many months in advance before their wedding, which is great. I love when they come many months before, because it could take a while to negotiate the terms of the prenuptial agreements. it may not, and when you look at all the work that's done and how long it takes to draft, it may not take that long. But what's difficult is having those conversations, the issues that are brought up that I need to talk about and discuss with my clients and then invite them to go back and speak with their fiance about. They're just tough things to talk about. It's talking about money, it's talking about finance, it's talking about the way that they each manage money, and now they have to come to terms with how you manage money and I manage money and how we're going to figure that out together. And I'm actually excited about the work that I'm doing with it, because I used to be the biggest opponent to prenups. I didn't have a prenup when I first got married many years ago, and I wish that I had, because there's so many things that I would have discovered and learned about him before walking down the aisle. And I don't know if it would have made our relationship stronger or otherwise, but I just feel that we would have been in a different footing.
What are some of the most interesting situations that you've had to resolve in real estate?
Wow, that's a great question. I actually had this fascinating one where this man came to me and he had told me he received a knock on the door of this house and a guy claimed that he owned part of his property. Yeah, it was really quite interesting. I was like, so I took a look and we dig through all his papers from his closing. Thank goodness I was not the lawyer that represented him when he purchased. So what happened was he bought a house. And he had a survey of the house, and the house was on a piece of land, and there was a fence all around. But what he missed, or what his lawyer missed, or whoever else was involved missed, that this land was comprised of 2 separate lots. So you had the lot where the house was on, and then you had this other strip of land. So even though when you come to the property, you see the house address, it looks like one piece of property, because there's a fence all around it, and it seems very clear that he's buying this address at this property. But the reality was that it was comprised of 2 separate lots, and so the contract should have mentioned both lots. The survey certainly mentioned both lots, but the deed didn't mention both lots. So he really only acquired title to 1 lot of what he believed to be his property. And so what was happening over the years was after you close, the tax bills then get changed over from the old owner's name to the new owner's name. Well, they didn't know to change the name of this other lot because there was no deed associated with it that was transferred. So those tax bills were still going to the former owner. And because of that, it then became a tax lien because it wasn't paid. And tax liens can be purchased by anyone because the county, the government is always looking, that's how they collect their revenue, so that we have roads and police department and whatnot. And so somebody had paid for and purchased the tax liens, and eventually, over time, it's a whole process. We won't get into that now, but that person acquired title to the deed to that land. And so eventually, through working with me, we were able to get that property conveyed back into his name. So now he owns the totality of his property, and he can live there. So that was one of the more interesting cases I've ever worked on.
Well, wait a minute. Did he have to pay to buy it back?
Yeah, he had to pay something. He basically paid back all the taxes, and he gave a few extra bucks so that the person wanted to make some money off of it too. So we reimbursed him for the taxes that were due, and then some.
Wow. So that's amazing.
I know, it's one of the craziest stories.
But that would be where title insurance comes in. But did they have title insurance?
They had title insurance. Again, there were so many errors that happened on that particular transaction. I would probably take up the whole show to go into it. But there were a lot of mistakes that were made throughout the entire process from so many different areas. So it's a shame that happened, but this is what happened to him, and thankfully I was able to help him get his hands on his title and be insured.
Wow. That's women are usually preyed upon more than men in scams.
Okay.
Real estate scams, whatever kind of scam you want to think about.
Mm-hmm.
Have you come across anything that women should be aware of?
I haven't, not really. I mean, the situations that I can think of, at least with regard to the work that I do, is I've represented a number of people who are going through a divorce and who own a marital home and it's being sold. And again, because I'm a divorce mediator, I used my mediation skills to work with the couple to balance both their interests. So the husband just wanted this done and finished and, you know, get his hands on his money, and the wife would call me up, but he forgot he needs to pay this bill, and we have to pay that bill. We got to make sure all of this paid. So I have everyone's concerned about different things, and so it really was a balancing act to get them to come to the table, sign the contract, so we had to get through that hurdle, and then at the closing table, distributing the funds in an appropriate way. So I had to be involved also with their respective matrimonial lawyers to make sure that it was divided properly. I had to look at their settlement agreement, and so there was just a lot at stake to understand. So if I wasn't fair, you know, if I was biased, which wouldn't be the right thing to do, but, you know, here I could have chosen to listen to one client and it would have been really bad for them. So here, you know, both of them came to me. I was representing both their interests, and I had to make sure that the proceeds from the sale were divided in accordance with what they had agreed to, the settlement agreement. Both their matrimonial attorneys signed off on it. So I really, you know, try to make sure that everybody is well represented. Everybody's getting what they're supposed to get. You know, I wouldn't want her to get less money than him, so to speak, in the division.
Well, let's go to closing. What happens at closing?
Everything happens at closing. Basically, it's a culmination of all the hard work that was leading up to getting your keys, your hands on the keys, seller getting paid for the balance of the purchase price. And so pretty much all of the paperwork is being signed. So the deed's being signed over by the seller. The deed is received by the purchaser, and the purchaser comes to closing. They have to come with certified checks, and they're signing all kinds of papers. So if it's in all cash, it's relatively simple and quick. Usually close within an hour. Just did one this past week like that. The transfer tax documents have to be signed. They get the deed, title company person is there. They can make sure we're getting clear title. They give us the policy at the closing table, and we get our keys. And if there's financing involved, then you also have the bank at the closing as well. So now there's another stack of papers that need to be signed, and I go through all the papers with my client. I explain the note, I explain the mortgage, I explain all the other documents that the bank's asking you to sign to protect their interests, and then the bank will release the funds from the mortgage amount, and it will be paid over to the seller. Now, sometimes the seller has their own mortgage on the property, so that needs to be paid off. So if it's a condo or a house, they'll just present a payoff letter from their lender, and we'll give a certified check to cover that. But if it's co-op, it's a little different. You have an additional person at the closing table, and so that person's representing the bank, and they actually coming, they're like, well, we have that document that I talked about before about in Albany that was filed. So now they are going to terminate that lien, and they won't release that paper until they have the check in their hand. So it's done simultaneously at the closing table. So there's quite a few people that we need to coordinate and get to closing, which can be a frustrating process for some people because they hear, oh, we can close. Great, let's close this tomorrow or in the next couple of days. But there's a lot of people to coordinate. We need to schedule the buyer, the seller, both lawyers for both sides. If there's a bank attorney, title company, if there's a bank for the seller, the bank for the seller needs to show up, and of course the real estate brokers. You know, they're the ones who were the beginning of it all. You know, they need to be invited to the closing, and they get paid as well. So
that's the most important check, is the one to the broker.
Absolutely. I always make sure that the broker gets their check before anything is completed at the table, and of course my client gets the keys so that they have the key to their new home. So,
in the closing moments of the show, Sabra, what would you like to leave the audience with?
So, to me, I think it's so important for people to have choices. And you have the most choices when you plan in advance. So if it's possible for people to interview and select and really get their dream team in place, you know, their real estate lawyer, their mortgage person, and their real estate broker, then they're going to be well taken care of, and they can trust those people. But if they have to make a rash decision at the last second, who am I going to hire? I'm not saying that you'll hire the wrong person, but if you can pick them a little bit ahead of time and have more involvement in who's on your team, I think it'll bring a lot more calm and comfort to the entire process.
Sabra, thank you so much for joining me. It's been really great listening to the other side of the story on how to buy and sell real estate. And I thank you for joining us, and I hope you've learned something. Love to hear from you. Please write us here at the Women's Connection. Bye now.